Imagine walking down the bustling streets of 19th century America. Markets alive with chatter, ships docking, merchants shouting. Yet hidden behind brick walls and barred windows were dark, suffocating rooms filled with people waiting to be sold. These were not ordinary jails, but slave pens, cages where human beings were stored like livestock, treated as property and stripped of dignity. They were part of the machinery of slavery, spaces designed to erase humanity and reduce men, women, and children to dollar signs. Unlike the cotton fields or the sugar plantations we often hear about, these hidden prisons were the silent backbone of the slave economy, feeding the auctions and sustaining the trade. Few talk about them today, but they were real, and they held thousands of lives in captivity. This is the story of slavery's hidden spaces, the slave prisons, pens, and holding cells that chained America's soul. The story of American slavery is often told through the fields, the endless rows of cotton, tobacco, and sugarcane that enslaved men, women, and children were forced to cultivate under the brutal sun. But behind those fields existed another, less visible system of captivity, one that made the very trade in human beings possible: the slave pens and prisons scattered across cities and towns. These places were the nerve centers of the domestic slave trade, functioning as warehouses of flesh, temporary holding cells, and auction preparation sites. To understand slavery in its entirety, we must step inside these hidden spaces. Slave pens, sometimes called slave jails or holding pens, were usually located in major slave trading hubs such as New Orleans, Richmond, Charleston, Natchez, and Washington, D.C. They were often run by professional slave traders who bought, stored, and sold enslaved people as though they were merchandise. Some were small wooden structures or basements beneath urban buildings. Others were sprawling complexes with high brick walls, iron bars, and multiple rooms for confinement. The pens were strategically placed close to auction houses and markets, so that enslaved men, women, and children could be moved quickly to the block when it was time for sale. One of the most notorious examples was Franklin and Armfield's slave pen in Alexandria, Virginia. From the outside, it appeared to be just another business building, but inside it was a place of horror. Franklin and Armfield was among the largest and most profitable slave trading firms in the United States, and their pen held thousands of enslaved people before they were shipped south or sold at auction. Eyewitnesses described the sight of hundreds of people crammed into dim rooms, shackled, waiting for their fate. The company made enormous profits by treating human beings as inventory, buying them in the Upper South where enslaved labor was considered less valuable, and selling them in the Deep South where demand was booming. Conditions in these pens were unspeakably harsh. The enslaved were packed tightly into rooms, often forced to sleep on bare floors with little or no bedding. Food was minimal, usually bread and water, enough only to keep them alive. Hygiene was non-existent, and diseases spread rapidly in the crowded spaces. Many accounts describe the stench that hung in the air. Sweat, sickness, and despair combined into a suffocating atmosphere. Some pens had outdoor yards where enslaved people could be exercised, not for their health or dignity, but so they would appear strong and fit at auction. Traders knew that appearance could raise the selling price, and so enslaved men and women were sometimes oiled or forced to march in circles to show their muscle tone. Families were routinely torn apart within these walls. A mother might be confined with her child for a night, only to awaken the next morning and discover that the child had been sold to a different buyer. Husbands and wives were separated without warning, often sold into different states. The slave pen was a place where these brutal divisions occurred, the last space where families clung to one another before being shattered forever. While the pens functioned as holding facilities, they were also deeply connected to the financial system of slavery. Traders used them as warehouses of capital. Each enslaved person represented a sum of money, and keeping them locked up ensured that the investment was secure until the sale. In this way, the pens were both prisons and banks, spaces where black bodies were counted as currency in the larger machinery of global trade. The city's position as a port meant that enslaved people arriving by ship could be quickly confined in pens before being displayed for sale. Some of these pens were attached directly to the offices of traders, while others were hidden in residential neighborhoods. Residents of New Orleans often lived within walking distance of these prisons, hearing the muffled cries of men and women behind walls, but choosing to look away. Not limited to the South. In Washington, D.C., just blocks from the U.S. Capitol, stood the infamous Roby slave pen. From the windows of government buildings, lawmakers could have seen the holding cells where enslaved people were chained awaiting sale. The irony was stark. As the nation's leaders debated liberty and democracy, human beings were locked in cages within sight of their offices. The very existence of these pens reveals the industrial scale of slavery. The pens were not just temporary spaces. They were permanent, organized facilities built to handle the constant traffic of human lives being bought and sold. They illustrate how deeply slavery was woven into the urban fabric of America. Even in cities that prided themselves on progress and commerce, these prisons were part of daily life. Travelers who witnessed the pens often left shocked accounts. Some abolitionists wrote descriptions meant to stir outrage in the North. They told of iron collars clamped around necks, chains rattling in the darkness, and the silence of despair that hung over the rooms. Formerly enslaved people who survived the pens later described the terror of confinement, the uncertainty of not knowing who would buy them or where they would be taken. Economically, the pens were indispensable. The domestic slave trade was worth millions of dollars annually by the mid-19th century, and pens were its infrastructure. Without these spaces to confine, process, and distribute enslaved people, the system would have faltered. They were the warehouses of America's most inhumane commerce, hidden in plain sight but crucial to the nation's economy. To walk through a slave pen today, where some have been preserved as historic sites, is to feel the weight of silence. The barred windows, the iron rings fixed into the walls where chains once held human beings, the narrow, airless rooms, all remind us that slavery was not an abstract system, but a physical reality. It was built of brick and iron, designed to confine flesh and spirit. These pens were not mere holding cells. They were monuments to the cold efficiency of slavery. They reveal a system that sought not only to exploit labor, but to strip away every shred of humanity from those it enslaved. In their walls, we find the truth about slavery's machinery. It was organized, calculated, and ruthless, operating through spaces designed to reduce people to property. Behind every brick wall, behind every barred window of a slave pen, there were not just anonymous figures, but real lives with names, faces, and voices. The story of these hidden prisons cannot be told without hearing from the people who endured them. Their memories and testimonies, some written by abolitionists, others preserved through memoirs or echoed in oral history, reveal the raw humanity that survived inside those cages. While the slave pen economy operated like a business, it was lived as trauma by the men, women, and children who passed through its doors. One of the most famous accounts of confinement in a slave pen comes from Solomon Northup, whose memoir, 12 Years a Slave, became one of the most detailed first-hand narratives of enslavement. Northup, a free black man from New York, was kidnapped in Washington, D.C. in 1841. He awoke to find himself in William H. Williams's slave pen, also known as the Yellow House. Situated not far from the U.S. Capitol, this pen was one of the largest and most notorious in the city. Northup described waking up in chains, disoriented and terrified, realizing he had been drugged and sold into slavery. In his memoir, he painted a chilling picture of the pen's interior. Iron shackles fixed into the floor, barred windows that allowed only a dim light to enter, and the cries of others who had been torn from their families. Northup's words force us to confront the cruel reality. Slave pens were spaces where freedom was stolen and identities erased in an instant. Harriet Jacobs, author of Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, did not spend time in a slave pen herself, but she vividly captured the terror enslaved people felt at the threat of being confined in one. She described how the possibility of being sold south and thus imprisoned in pens before auction was used as a weapon by slaveholders to instill obedience. For Jacobs, the threat was almost as cruel as the act itself. It represented the looming shadow of the slave pen in the minds of countless enslaved people, a symbol of despair and separation. But not all accounts came from enslaved voices alone. Abolitionists who investigated or witnessed slave pens often published their findings in newspapers and pamphlets to awaken moral outrage in the North. Theodore Dwight Weld, for example, described slave pens as dungeons of despair, detailing how enslaved men and women were shackled together, often stripped naked and displayed like cattle. Abolitionist literature frequently compared these pens to medieval torture chambers, emphasizing the barbarity of locking human beings in cages. Inside the walls, the daily experience was one of waiting, an endless, anxious limbo. Enslaved people confined in pens often did not know when they would be sold, who would buy them, or where they would be taken. This uncertainty was psychological torment. Mothers clung tightly to their children, fearing each passing moment might be their last together. Some tried to resist, screaming or pleading with traders, but their voices rarely mattered in the machinery of commerce. Traders treated resistance as an inconvenience, silenced either by force or threats. For children, the pen was especially confusing and terrifying. Accounts describe young boys and girls crying for parents, unable to understand why they were locked away. To the enslavers and traders, they were simply smaller bodies to be priced, sold, and shipped. But to the parents inside those pens, each moment with a child was bittersweet, shadowed by the possibility of separation. The physical brutality of the pens was compounded by the emotional anguish. People were chained together in pairs or groups, forced to eat from communal troughs and given no privacy. The constant surveillance by guards and traders stripped away even the smallest sense of dignity. For women, the pens were also sites of sexual exploitation. Traders and buyers often inspected them invasively, treating their bodies as objects to be assessed. Some women wrote later of the deep humiliation they felt, describing it as one of the most dehumanizing aspects of confinement. Yet even within this horror, traces of resilience and humanity persisted. Testimonies mention enslaved people comforting one another, singing quietly in the night or sharing whispered stories of home and family. These acts, though small, were a way of resisting complete erasure. They affirmed identity in a place designed to strip it away from the pens. Other survivors recounted their experiences long after emancipation, often in interviews during the Federal Writers' Project in the 1930s. Elderly, formerly enslaved people recalled the fear of being taken to the pens, describing them as the most dreaded part of the trade. For them, the pen symbolized the breaking point of slavery, the space where everything familiar could be lost in an instant. Some accounts even describe escapes from slave pens, though these were rare and perilous. Guards were ever present, walls were high, and punishments for attempts were severe. Yet there were instances of enslaved people breaking free, even if only temporarily. These stories show that even in the darkest confinement, the desire for freedom never dimmed. One chilling reality of the pens is how ordinary they appeared from the outside. A passerby in New Orleans or Richmond might see a large brick building, perhaps with a yard enclosed by high walls. They might hear faint cries or the clinking of chains, but could easily ignore it. For many white citizens, the pens became invisible, folded into the urban landscape as just another business. It was this normalization that made them especially insidious. Entire communities learned to accept cages of human beings as part of daily life. For the enslaved, however, the memory of these spaces never faded. Even after freedom, survivors spoke of the terror they had felt within those walls. The pens became symbols of slavery's cruelty, etched into memory alongside the whip and the auction block. They remind us today that slavery was not only about forced labor, it was also about forced captivity, about the deliberate breaking of bodies and spirits within confined walls. When we read the stories from the cells, we are reminded that these were not nameless victims, but people with voices strong enough to echo through time. Their testimonies break through the silence that once surrounded the pens. They tell us that behind the statistics and economic figures of the slave trade were individuals who loved, feared, resisted, and endured. The slave pens, for all their cruelty, could not erase that humanity. When the Civil War ended in 1865 and the Emancipation Proclamation became reality, many Americans believed that slavery's systems of control had vanished overnight. The chains had been broken, the auction blocks dismantled, the slave pens emptied. Yet in truth, the logic of confinement that slavery depended upon did not disappear. It transformed, reshaping itself into new structures that continued to control black bodies long after the legal end of slavery. To understand America's modern prison crisis, one must first look back to the slave pens, those early laboratories of captivity that laid the foundation for systems still with us today. Slave pens were not just warehouses of human property. They were part of a larger philosophy of control. Enslaved people were not seen as individuals, but as commodities to be guarded, contained, and disciplined. The walls of the pens taught both enslavers and society at large that black existence could be managed through confinement. Once slavery ended, This philosophy of control found new outlets in prisons, jails, and convict leasing systems. The cages of slavery gave way to the bars of incarceration. The connection between slave pens and modern prisons is not merely metaphorical, it is historical and direct. During slavery, escapees and runaways were often treated as criminals. Laws such as the Fugitive Slave Acts of 1793 and 1850 required that any enslaved person who attempted to flee could be captured, imprisoned, and returned to their enslaver. Slave pens frequently doubled as jails for captured runaways. This meant that long before the abolition of slavery, black resistance was criminalized and confinement was the punishment. In this way, the architecture of the slave pen foreshadowed the prison cell. Consider the geography of control. Many former slave pens were later converted into jails or prisons. In places like Richmond and New Orleans, structures once used to hold enslaved people became county jails after emancipation. The spaces of confinement did not vanish. They were repurposed to maintain racial hierarchies in new ways. The continuity of bricks and mortar mirrored the continuity of ideology. Black freedom was still something to be restrained. After emancipation, Southern states quickly passed black codes, laws designed to control the newly freed population. Under these codes, black people could be arrested for vague offenses such as vagrancy, loitering, or not having proof of employment. Once arrested, they were imprisoned, and many prisons bore striking resemblance to the old slave pens. Crowded cells, forced labor, chains, all of these elements persisted. Freedom, it turned out, was conditional and fragile. From these black codes emerged the system of convict leasing. States leased prisoners, most of whom were black, to private companies, plantations, and railroads. This practice was slavery in all but name. Prisoners were forced to work under brutal conditions, often with higher death rates than during slavery itself, because companies had no financial incentive to keep them alive. The legacy of the slave pen lived on in these convict labor camps. People were locked up, treated as disposable property, and exploited for profit. The economics of slavery thus survived through incarceration. Where once slave traders made fortunes by storing and selling human beings in pens, now states and companies made fortunes by leasing prisoners into forced labor. The system was different in name but not in function. Confinement continued to be a tool for economic exploitation, and black people remained its primary victims. The psychological parallels between the slave pen and the prison cell are also striking. In both, the captive faced dehumanization. The walls served not only to restrict movement but to send a message: you are not free, you are controlled. For formerly enslaved people, who had endured confinement in pens, the rise of prisons after emancipation was a bitter reminder that the cage had not disappeared. The form had shifted, but the spirit of control remained. Historians have noted how the imagery of criminality attached itself to blackness during this era. In slavery, black people were criminalized for resisting captivity. After emancipation, they were criminalized for existing outside the strict confines of racial hierarchies. The association of blackness with criminality justified the expansion of prisons and the continuation of forced labor. Thus, the shadow of the slave pen stretched forward in time, shaping public perceptions that linger even today. Mass incarceration in the modern United States cannot be separated from this history. The disproportionate imprisonment of black Americans reflects centuries of conditioning that began in the slave pens. The logic remains: control through confinement. Just as enslavers profited from pens, so too do corporations and governments profit from prisons. The prison industrial complex echoes the slave trade economy, turning confinement into a source of wealth for the powerful. The cultural memory of slave pens also influenced how society understood punishment. The normalization of locking up human beings, something perfected in the slave trade, made it easier for the public to accept prisons as natural institutions. Had there not been centuries of conditioning through slavery, perhaps Americans might have questioned the morality of cages more deeply. But by the late 19th century, the idea that confinement was the natural response to black existence was already ingrained. This continuity was not hidden from those who lived it. Formerly enslaved people who saw their children and grandchildren imprisoned recognized the cruel irony. They spoke of prisons as new slave pens, understanding that emancipation had been incomplete. Their testimonies remind us that freedom was not a single event in 1865, but a struggle that extended into the 20th and 21st centuries. Even the architecture of prisons reflected the legacy of slave pens. Narrow cells, barred windows, iron shackles. All of these design elements had been perfected in the earlier system of slave confinement. Just as pens had been designed for efficiency, not humanity, prisons too were built to maximize control rather than rehabilitation. The philosophy was the same: break the body, contain the spirit, and profit from the labor. The haunting truth is that slavery's hidden spaces never fully disappeared. They evolved. What began as pens and holding cells became jails, convict camps, and eventually the sprawling prison system of today. The same society that once normalized cages for enslaved people continued to normalize cages for the descendants of the enslaved. By tracing this lineage, we see that slave pens were not just historical footnotes, they were blueprints. They taught America how to build a system of captivity that could survive the abolition of slavery. They remind us that the shadows of those hidden spaces stretch across centuries, shaping the world we live in now. To stand in the ruins of a slave pen today is to see not only the past, but also the present reflected back. The barred windows echo the cells of modern prisons. The shackles rusted into the walls resemble the handcuffs of police custody. The voices that once cried out for freedom in the pens resonate in the cries for justice in today's prison yards. The connection is undeniable, and it demands that we reckon with slavery not as a closed chapter, but as a living legacy that continues to shape lives. When slavery ended, many of the pens and prisons that had confined thousands of men, women, and children were left standing. Some were abandoned, their walls collapsing into ruin. Others were repurposed, turned into warehouses, businesses, or homes. A few became county jails, and yet, for the most part, the nation chose to forget these sites. The physical structures may have remained, but the memory of what happened inside them was quietly erased. To look at America's urban landscape today, one might never know how many hidden spaces of slavery once existed. This forgetting was not accidental. It was deliberate. Just as the slave pens had once been hidden behind brick walls, their history was concealed after emancipation. Communities wanted to move forward, to wash away the stain of slavery without confronting its full brutality. Property owners demolished or remodeled the pens, not to preserve their history but to obscure it. By the early 20th century, many slave pens had vanished from public awareness. Yet the walls still whisper. In Alexandria, Virginia, the old Franklin and Armfield slave pen was preserved almost by accident. For years, the building served as a jail and later as offices. Today, it houses a museum, the Freedom House, that tells the story of one of America's largest slave trading firms. Visitors can still see the barred windows and narrow rooms where enslaved people once waited for sale. Standing inside, one feels the weight of absence, the countless voices silenced, the lives transformed in those confined spaces. In New Orleans, archaeologists have uncovered remnants of slave jails beneath modern streets. Layers of bricks, iron shackles, and foundation stones tell the story of pens once bustling with human traffic. These discoveries forced the city to acknowledge what was long ignored. Slavery was not only on plantations, but woven into the urban fabric. Every auction, every pen, every holding cell was part of the city's growth. Yet for every site remembered, countless others are lost. Many were torn down without record, their histories surviving only in faint mentions within court documents or abolitionist accounts. Families who lived near them often remained silent, passing down no stories. Eager to distance themselves from the shame of complicity, the silence became part of the forgetting. The struggle to preserve these sites today reflects broader debates about how America remembers slavery. Should the ruins of slave pens be marked with plaques? Should museums be built around them? Or should they remain in silence, left to decay as relics of a past too painful to confront? These questions stir controversy, for remembering slavery's hidden spaces means acknowledging not only the suffering of the enslaved, but also the responsibility of those who profited from their confinement. Some communities have taken courageous steps. In Kentucky, historians identified the sites of slave jails once used to confine people before auction. They marked them with memorials, ensuring that the stories of those imprisoned would not be lost. In Charleston, efforts are underway to preserve old structures connected to the domestic slave trade. These initiatives are small but powerful acts of memory, resisting the erasure that has long dominated the narrative.